everybody, welcome to Click 3D. This is the program where we talk about photogrammetry and how you can use a digital camera and some software to create some realistic looking 3D models. My name is Eugene Liscio and I'm a 3D forensic analyst. I've been using photogrammetry for years now. I think it's an incredible technology where you can do a lot with very little. And so for taking measurements from photographs, creating 3D models, doing different types of analysis, it's absolutely fantastic. Today I thought we'd try something that's a little bit challenging, and that is I'd like to get a 3D reconstruction or a model of this bullet cartridge case, okay, just the head of the cartridge case. Now there's some little inscriptions on here that I want to capture. We're talking about something that is only a few millimeters in size. So this is going to be quite challenging because it goes right to the limits of the hardware, of the camera, lens, and depth of field and stuff like that. So let's try it out, let's see what happens, and we'll get started right now. Okay, so this is going to be a pretty challenging project. Doing something very small like a cartridge case really gets to the limit of your hardware and sometimes your patience too. People will sometimes ask, how big of an object can I visualize with a camera using photogrammetry? Well, if you think big, it's really not that big of a deal because you can use a drone and you can get hundreds of feet up in the air and visualize or reconstruct really, really huge areas of roadways, landscapes, and things like that. But when we do the opposite, when we start getting down small, we start running into problems with the lens and the hardware. So these are the kinds of things we need to start considering in order to maximize the amount of resolution that we get here. So the first thing is hardware, and what can I use to my advantage? Well, the first thing is high resolution camera, so a good digital SLR camera. This is an older one, it's a Nikon D7100. I know a lot of you have full frame cameras and that sort of thing. That is super helpful. More resolution, more pixels is going to be super helpful. Now, the lens is also really important. So I'm using a macro lens here. This is a Nikon 40 millimeter lens, and if you have a 40, a 50, or a 60 millimeter lens, a macro lens, then you're going to be in pretty good shape. Any of those could work without too much of a problem. One of the limitations with the lens is being able to get in close. So if I just use a regular lens, like an 18 to 35 lens, I'm going to run into some problems because I'm not going to be able to get close enough. This thing is going to just show up as just a few pixels. It's going to be, I'm not going to be able to get close. Okay, so that's very important. We have to fill the camera's view with this face of this cartridge case. So that's really, really important. Now, other things that I'm using is if I'm getting in close, now the table here is not the best because it wobbles a little bit, and also when you're in close and you're pressing the shutter here, you can cause small vibrations. So I have a little remote for my camera. When I set everything up, what I do is I just hit the remote and I live with that. I'm hands off, no vibration or anything like that, so that gives me the best image possible. I'm going to be using some long exposures, so if it's vibrating, I'm going to get a blurry image, so I just don't want that. So that's definitely something that I'm going to be using. There are other things that you can use. So one is, fixturing your object, and so there are things you can use like, oh, I had one here, down here. This is just a turntable, so if you have a small object that you want to put on here and you want to rotate around, you can definitely do that. I've done the cartridge case here before and rotated around. It's okay, but for something this small, it might even be better to use something like this. So I just have a little stand, I put a threaded rod here, and I put the cartridge case out on the end. This allows me to do a couple of things. I can bring this up close, and I can take the camera and easily move it up, down, side to side, or whatever. I would be okay if I put it down on the ground kind of thing, but I just like this position here because it gives me a lot of flexibility. So having some kind of a fixture is really, really helpful. So that's good too. Now, in terms of the lighting that I got here, it's not the best, but it's okay. I may get some glaring, but it's not too bad. So if you do run into a situation where it's really, really bad, you can use a polarizing lens. And so a polarizing lens will reduce glare and reflections. I'm not going to get into it too much, but basically if you have one of these, you can adapt it to your lens and just kind of rotate it around until you minimize the amount of glare. It does darken the image, so you'll need different types of exposure settings, but it's super useful. Now, something else that you can use is having some kind of object as a background for your whatever it is that you piece of evidence or whatever it is that you're going to visualize. So I just took a block of wood and I drilled some holes through it here, and this little block of wood I can put the cartridge case inside. Now you can imagine if I start to photograph the cartridge case here, I don't have anything in the background, and so this will take up maybe 40 or 50% of the view, but then the background is just nothing. It's just a blurry image. So having something like this where the head of the cartridge case sits flush is helpful, and the reason is that it doesn't try to reconstruct just the cartridge case, but it also reconstructs the surface of this block. And this block, or whatever it is that you want to use, it's nice when it has a sort of random texture, and it can be used to reconstruct. You don't want something that's just white or just a very plain or reflective. So this block of wood is not reflective at all, and it has the grains of wood and stuff like that can help with colors and features. I've even painted these before, where you use like a stone speckle paint, and it's flat, but it has a lot of little dark and light spots in it, and that can be super helpful. So I'm going to tackle this project a couple of ways, but I'm going to end up doing this or showing you one main way. Whenever I do a project like this, I end up with a lot of failures or projects that I don't like, so I end up going back and doing it again and again and again until I get something that I like. And I've done this many times, and every time I set it up and try it, I'm always tweaking and adjusting. So in terms of the settings, this is really important, and I've said this over and over, but the big three things with your digital camera are going to be the ISO setting. So ISO is the sensitivity of your sensor to light, and so what we're going to do is we're going to use a low setting. So if you use a high setting, it becomes more sensitive. It's great if you're photographing in low light situations or at night, but you get grain in your images, you get a lot of noise, and so that's something we don't want. So we're going to turn that down to ISO 100, and some cameras will allow you to go even less, and that'll give you a nice crisp image with very, very little noise. The second thing is going to be the aperture, and this is an important one. So aperture has to do with the opening and how much light you're going to allow into the camera or into the sensor. Now you would think, hey, just open it up real wide and get a lot of light in. That's what we want. Well, you know, if you're just shooting casually outdoors or something, that's okay. But in this case, one effect of having a very wide opening or a low F number is that you get a reduced depth of field. And this really becomes magnified when you're using small objects like this and you're getting in close. You end up with a very, very small depth of field. And if you just move it, you know, a millimeter one way or the other, or if, for example, the object is sort of on an angle and part of the object is farther away to the lens than the other, part of it is going to be out of focus, or it's just going to be blurred. And that's something that we don't want. So what I'm going to be using in this situation is a high F number. So F28, F32, you need to put it up really, really high. That will maximize your depth of field. Okay, so that's a really important one. Finally, your shutter speed. So the shutter speed is the one that I usually leave for last. I try to set up my ISO and then my aperture and then see what I'm dealing with. So a couple of things we can do there. So if I have a very small opening for the aperture and I'm letting in less light, but I've increased my depth of field, I may need a long exposure of several seconds, you know, 7, 8, 10, 15 seconds, just depends on the scenario there. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that, so long as you have a good sturdy tripod and you're not moving anything. So that's one of the reasons why I was going to use the remote, and I don't have to touch anything, I don't have to press the button, there's no vibration. So that's going to be helpful. The other thing is that I can throw some lighting at this, so additional lighting will help. Now I'm going to be careful about lighting because this is a shiny surface and I don't want to get a lot of glare. If you get a lot of glare, then you're going to have problems with noise and all kinds of different issues. So I just have just a desk lamp here that I can control the brightness on, how bright or how dim I want this, which is great. And you know, it doesn't need to be anything fancy. Just throw any light at this and just, you know, try to reduce the glare as much as possible, and then, you know, you're probably okay. So I'm going to try this a few ways. One way is going to be where I just stick the cartridge case up on the mount like this, and I'm going to take a bunch of pictures by moving around. And then the second one that I'm going to try is I'm going to try to put this cartridge case in the block here, and I'm going to stick this block like that on here, and I'm going to stick this in front of the camera, make sure that's inside nice, and then I'm going to take some more pictures. And like I said, the block is really helpful because it's going to help to reconstruct, you know, so I just don't have an empty background, and it helps to maximize the number of points. Now, when I'm taking these photographs, a couple of considerations. One is I need to maximize the view of the cartridge case in the lens, okay? So I need to bring it really, really close, okay? So I'm gonna be just, you know, a few centimeters or whatever away from the lens. And if I move it just a millimeter one way or the other way, you'll see that I'll get out of focus. So the second thing that I'm gonna be doing is I'm gonna be checking the focus. And by doing that with the digital zoom, I'm just gonna zoom in really close, make sure that I'm getting a nice crisp image, and then, you know, I'll make some adjustments, and then I'll back off from that. Now, normally when you're doing photogrammetry, you want to shoot from multiple angles, and here I'm sort of limiting my angles because I'm just kind of shooting straight on, okay? Now, I'm sort of restrained in this regard because as soon as I move the camera up to an angle, I'm going to have a problem, and that is the depth of field is going to kick in and, you know, cause some areas that are going to be out of focus. So that's something that I just have to deal with. I'm going to shoot more or less straight, and I don't have to shoot a large number of images. I'm going to shoot maybe 6 to 10 photographs, something like that, and see what I get. And just kind of go from there. So I'm gonna get started, and I'll walk you through what I'm doing, my setup, and how this worked out for me. Okay, so I'll walk through the attempts and what I tried on this first one to create a nice model for the cartridge case head. So I thought at first I'd just use the stand that I have, put the cartridge case on there, and then, you know, have the camera just pointing right at the cartridge case head. I'm not going to use the block of wood on the first one, and I also decided that I wouldn't use any additional lighting. I'll just use what I have. It's not that bad here. It's fairly well lit, so I think I should be able to get something from it. In terms of the camera settings, I decided that I would definitely stick with ISO 100, and it seems like it's decent enough in here. And I went with a little bit lower aperture, so I went with f/16, and what I was thinking was I might be able to get a little bit more depth of field, or I might be able to get a little bit more lighting, excuse me, and a little less depth of field. So I had to work with a shutter speed of about 2 seconds, which wasn't too bad, minimized the amount of time that I had to take photos, but I definitely did have to use the remote. So I didn't want to press the shutter speed with my finger and then have things like vibrate and that sort of thing. Now, perhaps the most tedious thing about this particular setup and when you're using the macro lens and getting in close was that I had to constantly check the focus. I had to keep going back, moving things around a little bit left, a little bit right, making sure that everything was square. And just using the digital zoom on the camera, hitting the plus button there, getting in really, really close, and then adjusting it as best as I could, and then backing off, and then taking the shot. Now, every time that I moved it, though, I had to check it again. So this is not a very simple process. It is a little bit tedious, but it ended up working out in the end. So I had about 10 photographs that I took in this particular instance, and I also rotated the cartridge case around, and that kind of fakes it out from thinking that the camera might be in a slightly different position. But when you look at these images, you'll notice that there isn't a lot in the background, and the photographs have about maybe 50 or 60% of just empty background. So that is not going to help the reconstruction at all. So really it's only going to be focusing in on the cartridge case head, and then that's about it. So what I'll do is I'm going to process these in 3ds Zephyr, and the basic process is always the same. So the first thing I'm going to do is import the images, and I'm just going to drag and drop those inside of the 3ds Zephyr program, and it will recognize them. I'm going to click on next, and then I'm going to tell it to begin the sparse reconstruction. So when it goes in, it's going to look for a number of different features or key features, and then it's going to go through all the different images, and it's going to try and connect them, or it's going to try and reference one set of key images or key points to the others. And once it has that all done, it basically has what's called a sparse reconstruction. So you'll see that there are a number of points that it was able to reconstruct on the surface of the cartridge case head. Now, it's not really dense, and this is usually the point at which you can get a first indication as to how well your model is reconstructing. So I can tell already when I start looking around that it's not that great. Yeah, it did get something, but we'll continue on anyway and just see what happens. And what we'll do next is go to the dense reconstruction phase. And this is where it's gonna go back to the pixel level and start matching a whole bunch of different pixels to give us a nice dense point cloud. And when that is complete, of course I'm fast forwarding a little bit here and skipping over, but with only 10 images, it doesn't take very long. Now you'll see on the dense reconstruction that there is a bit of noise, and when you sort of rotate around the image, the points are not all on the same surface, and you can also see that where there's any glare or where there's any shiny spots, you get a problem with noise. And so it has a problem trying to figure out where the actual surface of the cartridge case is, and so you just end up with a lot of garbage. So there really isn't a lot more we can do here. We can try a couple of little things, but if you start off with photos that are bad, it's just easier to go back and take better photos, and that's the best thing you can do. But just for the sake of following the process, I'll go through and I'll construct the mesh. Now, if your dense point cloud is noisy, you can't expect to have a really good 3D mesh. And in fact, once we get this part of the process done, you'll notice that I have a really bumpy mesh. Now, when the textures or the colors are showing, just be careful because it always fakes out the quality of the actual geometry that's there. So what you should always do whenever you have a photogrammetry model is shut off all the color and just look at the geometry, right? What I want in my case is to reconstruct really good geometry. If you were just looking for a model that looked good, that good enough at least to the eye, because you just want to use it in a presentation or something like that, then it's not really a problem. You could live with a lot less detail or a lot less quality or accuracy in the geometry. But if you really want something that is going to be useful in terms of measurements, then you kind of need to take that extra step and always inspect the model and make sure that you understand where it reconstructed well and where it failed. So this particular model, I could also apply a texture here, but it really doesn't make a lot of sense. It's not all that great. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to move on, and I'm going to try a different tactic for the second round of photos. So for my second attempt, what I thought I would do right off the bat is, instead of just taking photographs of the cartridge case head, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the wooden block onto this little stand. And what that is going to do is it's going to give me a background that it can use to visualize or reconstruct. So I can fill in the view as much as possible, and it can grab parts of the wooden block to create a 3D model with it. So that can be really helpful. In some cases, what I'll do is I'll paint the wooden block with like a speckled paint, or not anything that's shiny, but more like the stone fleck paint or something like that, just to break up the texture enough that it has a lot to hold on to. And the other thing that I did was I took my aperture, the f number, and I cranked that up to f32. So now I'm only letting in a very small amount of light. And as a result, when I take a picture, it's going to be really dark. So I started off with some high exposure or long exposures, like 8 seconds, 10 seconds. So I thought I would just add a little bit of light. So I used a small desk lamp and just moved it into position, tweaked it a little bit, and adjusted the brightness, and that seemed to help. So I got it down to 4 seconds exposure. I'm still using ISO 100, I didn't change that. And again, I've had to use the remote, and it's just a really great way to minimize the amount of vibration that you have on these things. If you don't have a remote, one thing that you can do is just use a timed delay and maybe just set it up for like 3 or 4 seconds or whatever to go off. So hit the shutter, stand back, let it settle down, and then when it takes a shot, it'll be a lot more stable and you'll have less blur. Now, I did notice that there is still a little bit of glare here, so I may or may not be able to fix that. I could use the polarizing lens, but I'm just gonna hold off on that for now and just see what happens. If there is a little bit of noise, that's fine. I think it'll make the point. And of course, again, I've had to check the focus every single time. Any small adjustment you make, just go back and check it. Use the digital zoom, get in close, and then make sure that everything is set up really, really well, and the images or the focus is really, really crisp. Okay, so next we're going to be going into 3ds Zephyr, and I'm going to run this through the exact same process. So the first thing is the sparse reconstruction, and when you run it through here, you'll notice that it did a really good job of the sparse reconstruction, and it also reconstructed part of the background where the wooden block was. Now, one key point here is that the wooden block and the head or the top surface of the cartridge case head have to sort of be in the same plane. It wouldn't help me a lot if the cartridge case was sticking far out from the block, because that would just give me a blurred background. So make sure that they're sort of on the same level, and that's one of the, I guess, limitations depending on the type of object that you're going to be doing here. But the sparse reconstruction looks really, really good. I can see that there might be a little bit of noise, but way better than what I had before. It seems a lot crisper. So the next step is going to be going into the dense reconstruction. And inside of the dense reconstruction, I'm just going to use the same settings and get in there and see what it will give me. Now, one thing I did change here was I went into a little bit more, to get a little bit more density in the point cloud. And so it's not necessarily going to give me better points, but it'll just give me more points. So if your model starts off noisy and you just ask for more points, you're just going to get more noisy points. But this one was actually quite good. I noticed that the dense reconstruction looked really good. The points seem to be all on the same surface, and there is some noise for sure. There's no doubt there's going to be a few spots here that are not all that great, but it seems to me that I'm miles ahead of where I was before. So some of the changes that I've made have really improved the reconstruction here. And what I'm going to do next is go into the mesh reconstruction, and let's see what that gives me here. So you'll see it looks way better. I don't have a really bumpy, lumpy mesh. It's much, much better, much improved over what I had before. And again, I always make sure to shut off the colors and just look at the mesh on its own, so it doesn't fool my eyes into thinking that it's better than it really, really is. And so this already is a big, big improvement over what I had. I'm going to go ahead and make the textured mesh. So I'm going to go back and get some nice textured colors from the photographs and then apply it to the mesh. Okay, so that's done now. And this is the final model, and you can see that it looks really good. I'm really happy with this. This is probably one of the better ones that I've been able to do here, and there's been a lot of tweaking and a lot of stuff that I've done in between that I haven't shown you, and I've made a few other attempts and they've just failed miserably. So I've just settled on this wooden block method and having a background, using the high f-stop number, and just being really, really careful about the focus. Now, when taking the photographs, one thing that I noticed is that I didn't have to have sort of angled shots. I shot most of them perpendicular to the surface of the cartridge case, and that seemed like it was pretty good. It seemed to give me a decent result. Now, the final model is okay. I'm fairly happy with what it looks like, but it does require some cleanup. You can see that there's a little bit of noise, or there's some areas where there was some glare or whatever, and it causes problems. It just takes some more work and some more tweaking, and you can clean up a lot of this stuff. But I hope this example showed you what you can do when you take a little bit of time, a little bit of care, and when you are trying to reconstruct very small objects using photogrammetry. It's actually really challenging. A lot of people, you should try it if you want to kill an afternoon and just tweak and give it a go, and it can be really, really useful. Again, I would recommend, if you want to try 3ds Zephyr, I can put a link down below as to where you can go get that. There's a free version. It allows you to use up to 50 photos, and it's a great little program if you want to get comfortable with and get to know photogrammetry. So I think I'm going to pause here, and pretty happy with the result. I hope you learned something on the setup that I had here and some of the experiments that I ran, and look forward to seeing you next time on Click 3D.